Business as usual here. If you're watching this video to get credit, throughout the video, I'm going to give a random set of attendance words or attendance phrases. And when I do, you're going to write them down and take a screenshot of when I take it. For example, today's first word for attendance is boot. So take a screenshot right now. Should be you should see the lit room, the blue screen that says Sanyo backwards. So you take a screenshot every time I say one of the words, and then at the end of the video, you email me the list of screenshots, or excuse me, email me the list of words and the screenshots that go with it. And the very last word for attendance, or phrase for attendance, if you want to call it that, is to ask me one question about the material presented in this video, and that's it. So it is about 7:30. It's 7:28 technically and some change, so you can go ahead and skip ahead about 30 minutes, and that's when the lecture will officially start.
Still, nobody here. What the fuck? How's your morning?
Normal, I guess. I was a sick kid, but not throwing up and violently sick, just sick enough not to go to school.
Uh-huh.
How about yours?
Slept in a little bit by an accident, but oh well.
You just going on accident?
Slept in by a little bit by an accident.
Yeah, it happens. You still got here early. Any plans for the weekend?
Not really. Notice I'm getting fat, so trying to go to the gym more often.
Feel that. I just don't have time for anything this semester. I at least used to run or bike all the time, but not even an option now.
Yeah, I feel that. I don't know. I think I'm just making an excuse. I'm just being lazy. There's be days where I'm like, I want to go. Days where let's go.
You gotta keep it consistent.
Yeah. So, do you know anything about lifting or proper diets? As I say, with my voice crack.
No, I haven't like done lifting to try to get big in decades. And when I did, it was just I had big people in my squadron that said, "Hey, eat a lot of protein." So like, okay, so I just did that. Like I don't even know if that's the proper thing to do.
Oh, okay.
I do know protein's good for other stuff too, so I figure high protein diet's usually the way to go, depending on where you get your protein. This is a big push recently, and I need to do more research about it, but this thing like, what they're like saying, hey, you should eat like this unhealthy stuff, saturated fats and stuff like that. As far as I know, that's still unhealthy. No, I don't know that. If you do some research, might as well save your notes, turn it into a paper, and get some extra credit for it. Because that is a biology topic,
I was trying to figure it out, but I was like, I know you guys take a lot of protein in, but I'm not too sure if you're supposed to do it based off of your weight or based off of what. So that's what I was trying to figure out. Someone said it was based off of something.
So I guess one of the questions too would be, maybe even the first question is what happens if you have too much protein? Because there's no, like it's really hard to get to too much protein, or if the consequences are negligible, then if that's the case, I might say just eat as much as you can. Not as much as you can, but go for it. Sort of like water. Like yes, water can kill you if you drink too much, but the ability, to do that is very hard to do. So for the most part, the pretty good advice is drink as much water as you can. For getting big too, but for all kinds of other reasons. But everything in moderation. Sometimes moderation is a lot. Like I said, with water, you can have a lot of water. What kind of movies do you like? Or do you like movies at all? My wife doesn't really get into movies.
I don't really watch much movies, but I do like a lot of horror movies. Conjuring is a big one.
Yeah. That's not my favorite genre, but when I do like, I guess, scarier stuff and gorier stuff. I don't like gory stuff. It's not like I dislike gory stuff. Sometimes like a good horror movie is like just trying to be gory. I don't like it just for the sake of being gross, but if it's scary horror, I like that.
I mean, comedy, if you want to go into comedy, there's a lot of it. Big Stan's one of them. I don't know if you watch that.
Which one?
Big Stan.
Sounds familiar. That's a movie?
Yeah, it's like rich guy went to prison for
Yes.
yeah.
When he has John Mayer plays guitar for him it's Will Ferrell and Kevin Hart.
Other one.
Oh, well,
That's
I
a-
recommend that one when you like comedies. Because that's a rich guy going to prison. And that's Will Ferrell. And he's as soft as
I forget which one you're talking about. I think I've seen that one actually.
big
I
stain.
can't remember. He's in like he plays alongside with Adam Sandler in Grown Ups. I can't.
The bigger Kevin something?
Nah, he's a. Ooh.
Oh, yeah. Well, how have I not seen this? I like him. Rob Schneider.
Yes.
Yeah, I love Rob Schneider.
I couldn't remember his name for the life of me, but he's He's a funny one. Little Nicky's also a good one too. Little Nicky's also.
Yeah, I like that. I like most of those movies in that circle. You know, like the Adam Sandler and Adam Sandler adjacent movies. Like Billy Madison, Happy Gilmore.
Yeah, they're all good. I like it all. So.
Big Stan, I'll have to watch that. That's from 2007. How did I not know that existed?
I'm trying to remember. There's more that I like, and I watch a lot of comedy. Grown-ups, not grown-ups. It's Step Brothers.
Oh, I love Step Brothers.
Yeah.
Man, that's so good. My buddy has a shirt, and I stole it from him. And he's obviously, as you might imagine, smaller than I am. He's got a Boats and Hose shirt. And I stole it from him because we steal each other's stuff. And he didn't know where it was for years. And then finally, like last summer or 2 summers ago, I forgot. I went on a road trip with my other friends. And one of my friends rented a sailboat for us to take out on the lake. So I was driving a sailboat wearing my Boats and Hose shirt, or his Boats and Hose shirt. And I got them to take a picture of it. And I sent it to him. He was pissed. I love it. Yeah, it's a good movie. It's a classic. A lot of quotables in that one.
Yeah. The comedy is good. I definitely like good comedy. Have you seen Happy Gilmore too?
Yes, and I loved it, but I don't know if it's because it was good or because it was nostalgic, you know, because I grew up, like I was prime age for when Happy Gilmore came out. I was like, I guess, 15 or 16, which is the prime age for that kind of comedy, so I loved it. So then when the second one came out, it was just really nostalgic. I liked it.
It was really good. I liked it. Like the Eminem's appearance is funny.
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's a few good cameos in that movie. I liked it. Also, I had no idea who Adam Sandler's wife was until, like, in real life, until I saw that movie. I was like, oh, yeah, her.
Adam Sandler's wife was in it?
Yep.
I didn't know that.
You'll recognize her. Hold on. Put it up on the screen.
You don't got Greg's up? I can come over?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. No way.
Yep.
I didn't even know that.
I didn't either until that movie. And then it's not like she had a big role. I forgot what it was. Just some little role. But I was like, oh, yeah. Yep.
What?
Yeah. Back to the Future's coming back out to the theater
Back to.
on October 31st. And I'm old, but I'm not that old, so I've not seen it in the theater, so I'm looking forward to that.
A good one, a really good one that I enjoy watching. Oh, I can't remember. I usually watch it every year. I forget the name of it. It's like Zoidbergs, I guess, or
What is it?
Zoidbergs. It's a house in the space.
Space?
Yes, but then it's all because of a board game.
Interesting.
I can't remember. Hold on.
I don't recognize that one either.
Zathura.
I don't know that one. I don't think. It's a comedy?
Not really.
No. Okay.
But it was filmed in 05.
Oh, yeah. 05 was a little bit off the radar as far as a lot of things are concerned in that. 03, 04, 05 was a interesting 3 years for me.
2000s to 2010s. Like there was a lot of good ones out.
Yeah, Wedding Crashers. The Hangover was 2 great, hilarious wedding movies. Old School, Road Trip.
The Hangover was definitely good. I like The Hangover.
Yeah, I even like the 2 sequels. Super Troopers. That's a classic. My buddies and I, when we were overseas, that's in the DVD days, and so we didn't have that many to watch. We watched that movie probably every night. It was a rotation between that and Dazed and Confused, and we would watch it every night. We were night crew, so we get off work at like, I don't know, 2, 3 in the morning, and go to the bunker or go to the barracks and start drinking be nice and drunk by the time day crew was up. So we'd stumble into the chow hall drunk, and they're all getting ready to go to work. It was fun times. And then we go back to bed, go back to our rooms, and crash. And
Have you seen High School? People are all facing in along with few other people I can remember.
if it's not Will Ferrell, I think I've seen it, but I just don't remember it. I don't recognize the name. Good morning. High school.
Oh no, it's called Old School. My bad.
Old school, yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's another one. Actually, that's where I got one of my Marine Corps nicknames. My middle name is, as weird as it is, it's Frank. And we were watching that movie. We were overseas in the movie theater. And that scene came on where Will Ferrell's just really drunk. And they all looked at me and because they started chanting Frank the Tank in the movie. And then my buddies just all looked at me. I was like, yeah, I know. So from then on, I was Frank the Tank. You get bored overseas.
Still some good movies.
Morning. I should open that door.
Morning.
All right, less than 3 minutes. We can start attendance. Romefield is not here yet. Champion is. Gross is online, but Gross, you still need to send in the attendance words to get your credit. Gunther is here. Randall Hill is here. The other Hill is not. Jackson is not here. Keys is here. Perez is here. Sigmund, not here yet. Slaughter is here. Smith is here. Stover is here. Tompkins is not here yet. Nest is not here. Watson is here. Young is not here yet. Zweiback is not here yet. Lawrence is not here yet. Wilson is not here yet. Did I miss anybody? We still have 2 minutes, so I'll just do the repetitive announcements, the ones you're used to hearing. Where are we at? There we go. So the genetics lab is past due today. Make sure you get that in on time. Normally, I would remind you to prioritize the pre-lab over the lab that we just did, but there is no pre-lab for next week. So hopefully you guys can have a slightly more enjoyable weekend and not having to worry about that, either getting it done or the grades you're going to get. So yes, no pre-lab today. Genetics lab is past due today. As a reminder, like I said, like I've been saying, make sure you check your course announcements and emails. I mean, you should always be doing that anyway. There's valuable information there. Make sure you check that, especially if you are not on campus and plan on coming to campus for lecture. All right. The other Hill is here. But anyway, yeah, check on that because, again, like I said, sometimes it could be a chemical leak next door, or there could be a snow day, or more likely, again, this happened today, my other daughter is sick now. And, luckily, we've had backup plans, so here I am. But sometimes my kids might get sick, and I might have to say it's 6:30 in the morning. Don't come in. We're meeting online, and I'll give you the link. So, any questions about that? All right. Yeah. So again, anyway, good advice to check the course announcements and emails. This one, I want to remind everybody what my office hours are. Normally, they're Monday 9 to 10, Wednesday 11 to 12, Friday 9 to 12. There's 2 reasons I bring that up. First of all, hold on. Jackson is here, and Sigmund is here. Anyway, one of the reasons I'm bringing that up is because today I have a department meeting, and it starts at 10. It usually lasts about an hour. So I guess the point here is today my office hours are going to be, like, I won't be there from 9 to 12. I'll be there at 9. I'll be there after my meeting, but there's going to be that chunk in the middle where I don't know when I'll be there. So just want to let you know that. I'm more than happy to meet you outside of office hours. Office hours aren't like, that's not me saying, this is the only time I can meet you. That's just me saying, this is the time I can definitely meet you. You don't have to schedule. You just show up online or in person in my office, and I'm there. Anytime after that, I'm happy to meet you. But as some of you know, sometimes it is hard for me to get my schedule matched with your schedule. So take advantage of office hours. Again, one of the reasons I brought that up is because today they're different. And another reason I brought that up is because one of your classmates, and I'm really proud of them for this, wrote me an email and said, hey, can we meet during office hours? So I'm worried about my grade and I want to turn it around. That's awesome, because now's the time to be worried about your grade, right? So if you're worried about it now, we can turn things around. If you start worried about it with a week left, you're probably out of luck. So Yeah, let me help you. So any questions about office hours? All right, speaking of which, if you have questions, like, because this is what brought this on, somebody was asking me about my office hours. So I'll remind you, like, if you have questions, you know, it's sometimes it might take me a while to email you back. So like you're in a hurry and you need the answer, go back to the announcements and the syllabus. But probably if you have a question about something in general, like what are your office hours, you can probably find it there. So I'll show you, for example, if you go to the course announcements, if it'll let me, I won't do it. Anyway, if you go to the course announcements and the syllabus, there's a search function, right? So you don't have to go scrolling through every single announcement. You can just hit the search button and look for office hours for this example. Or Lab 5, if you have questions about Lab 5, you type in Lab 5 and hit the search function, and it'll bring it up for you. So I only say that, it's not because I really don't mind answering your questions. I'm here for you. But again, if you're in a hurry, like you email me in the afternoon, you might not hear back from me until the next day. So if you're in a hurry, you have the announcements in the syllabus to answer your basic questions. Any questions about that? All right, now for some more repetitive stuff. Again, you can meet me online for exam 1. That's from now until the end of the semester. You can meet me online for exam 1, so I can give you all the correct answers, talk about why your incorrect answers are incorrect. You'll need that to study for the final exam, and you get a 5% boost to your grade for meeting me online for that. So any questions about exam 1? Okay, exam 2, again, it's still open for retake. I think you got about 3 weeks now to redo it. So you can redo exam 2 until exam 3 is due. And again, I think that's about 3 weeks. So again, open book, untimed, unlimited tries. So I recommend retaking exam 2 as many times as you can. Even if you got a good grade, it's just good practice. Because again, the final exam is based on the first 3 exams and some new information, right? So literally your first 3 exams are your study guides, half of your study guides. So to go in there and practice answering those questions, that'll help you. Any questions about that? Was that young? Yeah, all right. So is anybody I didn't call for attendance? All right. So that's almost all the announcements. Now the last one, and normally this is the first one, but I'm changing it up. I told you on Wednesday I might change it up a little bit, and I am changing it up. For today, it's almost business as usual, except now if you're in person, I do need you to send me that email before 9 a.m. But you don't have to do all the attendance words today. It's just one question. So as I'm giving the lecture, pay attention to it, and then afterwards send me one question about the information from the lecture. Now you can still do business as usual. I am still going to give out the attendance words. If you're online, you still have to send in the attendance words if you're watching this live stream. But the rest of you can still send those in for extra credit. But I do need you to send in at least one question to get any credit today. Like I said, I'm changing things up because I'm getting some questions where I can clearly tell people aren't paying attention because they're asking me questions about things I've said over and over and over again. So calling an audible here. So any questions about today's attendance since we're doing something new here? Okay, good to go. Also, even though it's mandatory and I'm saying you have to do it to get any credit, you're still going to get extra credit for doing it. It's like, it's a requirement, you get extra credit. If that makes any sense. All right, anyway, that's it for my announcements and reminders. Does anybody else have any announcements? You guys doing any fundraisers, anything like that? Anything we need to know about? All right, let's jump back into it then. Oh man, I wish I had a dry erase marker. I'm gonna have to try to write this on the screen. We'll see if it works. Anyway, remember this time, this whole exam 3, is mostly going to be about reproduction, basically, right? So the stuff like mitosis and meiosis, that was talking about cellular reproduction, right? Reproduction at the cellular level. And then this chapter that we're in right now, it's about genetics, right? So that also has a lot to do with reproduction because when organisms reproduce, we look at the outcome of that, and that's basically what genetics is, right? So this is where we left off. We left off talking about family pedigrees and talking about the fact that we can't study human genetics like we can study pea plants, which is the example we've been using all this after, or dogs, which is the most recent example we use, right? We can't do that. We cannot tell a human, you mate with you, so we can study your offspring, and then we're gonna take your offspring and have them mate with their offspring, so we can study their offspring. Like, you can't do that, right? So because of that, we have family pedigrees. Turn my screen off here, sorry. So let's take a look at these, we already talked about all that.
Let's take a look at this family pedigree. You might, maybe get a question like this on the exam. Probably not, because I haven't written that question yet. The exam is written. So if this question were to be on there, I would have to write it. Anyway, it's almost like a puzzle. Now, if you look at one of the labs, I forget which one, I would assume the one from this week, somewhere in there is a link where you can, I think, do some of these kind of puzzles for extra credit. But if not, I'll look into it and fix it. Anyway, let's take a look at this. You should be able to figure a lot of stuff out by using a family pedigree. So for example, remember what we talked about with earlobes, right? And this is not important. Earlobes are not important. It's just a very common example because, most of us all have earlobes, and we can usually tell if they're attached or not. So it's a very easy example. Anyway, remember, attached earlobes are a recessive trait, right? Free hanging earlobes are a dominant trait. So we know, right? And I think the exact letter doesn't matter, but can anybody remind me? Was the earlobes, did we use E for that? I think we used E for earlobes, like big E or little e. Either way, that's what we're going to go with for this example. So let's say E is the letter for this, right? So what would the genotype be for these people who have attached earlobes? Would it be big E, that is so horrible. Would it be big E, little e? Would it be little e, or would it be big E / or blank? Like, hey, we know there's one big E, but we don't know what the other one is. So what do you guys think? A, B, C, or D for these people in purple with the attached earlobes. And we can figure this out. Actually, not in this case, you're not really figuring it out. It should be pretty obvious. So which of these genotypes would these purple people be?
A.
I like that, but as a reminder, attached earlobes, that's the recessive trait. So free earlobes is dominant, attached earlobes is recessive. So now what do you guys think?
B.
Yes, D, right? So we know if they have attached earlobes, we know for sure they are homozygous recessive. They have to be. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the attached earlobe, right? Even if they had one big E, much less two big E's, they would definitely have free hanging earlobes. So these attached earlobes, they would have to be little e, little e. I'm going to try to draw that. All right, little e, little e. Okay. So, all right, there we go. Now, let's do something a little bit easier here. All right. So for now, we know these people are big E something, right? Everybody who has, is not purple is big E something. We don't know what the other one is. We know they must have at least one big E. Otherwise, they wouldn't have the attached earlobe, right? If they had two, or they wouldn't have the free hanging earlobe. We know that. Oh, that's so hard to write. I can write them all. That's going to take too long. I don't want to waste your time. So knowing this, can anybody guess what the genotype must be? Let me think about this. Yep. What must be the genotype for these two? It can be either big E, or big E, little e. Look at the big picture here. This is a great amount, even if you don't have this question or any type of questions like this on the exam, this is exactly the way your brain needs to be thinking for the exam. So what must these genotypes be? A hint, look at their offspring. Definitely E, but did you say E? B? Yeah, well, based on this, yeah, when I started here down, yes, it would be this. I don't know if that's what you meant, but that is correct. Because here's how we know this. For these offspring, both to be homozygous recessive, that means they got a recessive allele from their mom and a recessive allele from their dad. And we know the mom and the dad have at least one dominant allele, otherwise they would be purple, right? So we know they have to have at least one dominant. And now, because both of their kids are homozygous recessive, we know that they have to have at least one recessive allele. Because again, when you are homozygous, good grief, that's messy. Anyway, when you're homozygous recessive, that means you got a recessive allele from both of your parents, one from each, right? So anybody who has homozygous recessive their parents must have at least one recessive allele. I'm not gonna go through the rest of them, that's just the point there. Now, again, hopefully I'll get some of these that you can do, and I know this is geeky of me, and I am into biology, but I think that kind of stuff is fun, it's like a puzzle. Anyway, I'll try to share some of those with you. It's even if you don't do these, if you don't have this on the exam, it is still really good, it's a really good thought exercise that'll help you. Also, for some of these, might need to do a Punnett square to figure these things out. Again, you will need to do Punnett squares for the exam, so that would be good practice for you. So again, before I move on, one more time, I'm gonna try to give you some of these for practice. It won't be mandatory, it'll be extra credit. The first word for attendance is Mike Judge. It's more like a name, Mike Judge, the first word for attendance. Today is his birthday. And again, none of you who are here have to send in the words, but at the end, you will need to send in at least one, that question. But if you do send in the words, because you're emailing me anyway, might as well, because then you'll get more extra credit. So anyway, any questions about that? Because again, I'm not gonna waste your time going through all that. All right, let's take a look at human disorders controlled by a single gene. So back up a second. So far, everything I've taught you has been something controlled by a single gene. Right, so freckles, you either have this allele, right, it's one gene, and you either have this allele or you have that allele. Widow's peak, it's one gene for that. You either have this allele or that allele. Pea color, not urine, but the pea color of the plant, right? The flower color, everything I've taught you has been only one gene, and this is not an exception. We're still looking at the same thing, except now we're gonna talk about stuff that's a little bit more important to us, right? Because the color of a flower on a pea plant is not as important as maybe some of the diseases that humans carry. So let's look at that. Some disorders are known to be dominant or recessive. Again, this is what we've talked about, and also a little spoiler alert. Soon you're about to learn that not everything is as simple as dominant or recessive. So we're still working with this simple dominant versus recessive, but I want you to know that soon you're going to learn some exceptions to that rule. So again, everything we're talking about is controlled by a single gene. And as you're going to learn very soon too, not everything is like that, but we're still there looking at this relatively simple stuff. And we're looking at stuff located on autosomes. To remind you what that means, because you should know by now, we've talked about it earlier. Autosomes are any of your chromosomes that are not your sex chromosomes. So chromosomes number 1 through 22 for humans. So let's talk about some of these disorders. This is from, I don't know which textbook this is from. It's not from the one you are currently using. It's not from the old one that we used. I don't remember where I got it. It doesn't matter. But here you go. Here's some examples. Albinism. So that's a recessive disorder. So if you have albinism, obviously that means you're homozygous recessive. If you have cystic fibrosis, that means you must be homozygous recessive for that. PKU, homozygous recessive. Sickle cell, Tay-Sachs. All these things you would have to be homozygous recessive. You would need 2 recessive alleles to have those disorders because they are recessive disorders. Here's some examples of dominant disorders, dwarfism, Alzheimer's. I don't know, I need to find out where I got this table because that's not exactly accurate. What? I don't know how I've never noticed that before. Anyway, yeah, Alzheimer's is still a pretty tricky thing. It's definitely not something caused by one single gene, at least not that we know of. And anyway, Huntington's disease, hypercholesteremia. We'll talk about some of those, but I will say this, I will point this out. These are just examples. When you're studying for exam 3, you do not need to study this. There will be no questions where I say, where I may be like, all right, this disease results in excess mucus in lungs, digestive tract, liver, blah, blah, blah. Is it cystic fibrosis, albinism, or PKU, right? You won't get any questions like that. You do not need to memorize anything about these diseases. They're just some examples. So let's talk about some of these examples from the old textbook. First of all, and I might ask you this, I'm not quite sure yet, but most human disorders are recessive. Most human genetic disorders, anyway, are recessive. When we get to the dominant disorders, I'm going to say the opposite of that. I'm going to say something like, hey, dominant disorders are not as common as recessive disorders. So between now and then, start thinking about that and see if anybody can figure out why. Why is it that most disorders in humans, genetic disorders, are recessive instead of dominant? We'll come back to that. But again, that might be a test question. And once I explain why, hopefully it'll be easy for you to remember. Actually, take another step back. Hopefully I won't have to explain why. Hopefully one of you will guess it and explain it to the rest of us. Anyway, when we're talking about recessive disorders, again, to have the disorder, to have that disease, just like anything recessive, you have to have 2 recessive alleles. Therefore, individuals that have a recessive allele but appear normal, like they don't have the disease, they are called carriers. And that's another question I might ask you. And that's definitely a term that I would use in some of the questions. So you need to know what a carrier is. So like I've been saying, I think on Monday and Wednesday, maybe even last Friday, I've been saying for a while, there'll be questions where I say, this mated with this, what are the offspring? What are the possibilities of this being the offspring? So that's an important word, because when I talk about this person mating with this person, right? So if they're a carrier, again, that means they have one recessive allele, because if they had both, they would have the disease. So when I use the word carrier, what that really means in the context of you doing problem solving to answer a question is that they are heterozygous. So that's the kind of stuff you need to pay attention to. Because in some questions, I will say, someone homozygous dominant for this mates with somebody heterozygous for this. What are the possibilities that their child will be a male who's homozygous recessive or something like that, right? Sometimes it'll be straightforward like that. Sometimes I'm going to use these kind of keywords to make sure you understand them. So again, instead of saying they're heterozygous, I would say they are a carrier, right? So they carry that bad allele, but they don't have the disease because it's a recessive disease and they only have one allele, therefore they're safe. So any questions about that bullet point? All right, we can predict a fraction of the affected offspring that are likely to result from the mating between 2 carriers, just like anything else. When we're talking about this very simplified genetics where it's a single gene controlling a single character and there's only 2 alleles, this is all pretty simple, everything I've taught you so far. So just like anything else that's recessive, whether we're talking about flower color or the dog's fur color, anything like that, we can always predict a fraction of the affected outcome. So for example, and this is a picture from the old textbook, you might get a test question where I say, okay, hearing loss, and this is just an example, this isn't real, there's also different types of hearing loss. But assuming this was real, you might get some question where it says, it'll give you all the pertinent information, like hearing loss is a recessive disorder, right? So I'm going to tell you it's a recessive disorder. I'm not going to have you memorize the fact that hearing loss is a recessive disorder. But in the question, I'll say hearing loss is a recessive disorder. What are the chances of a carrier mom and a carrier dad having a kid who is deaf, right? You get a question like that, you'd have to remember, okay, he said it's recessive, so that means you need both alleles to have the disorder. He said the parents are carriers. That means they have at least one allele. That means they're heterozygous. So now I'm going to do a Punnett square. And you do the Punnett square, and like you see, just like you did in lab, big D come together. Okay, so there's one big D, big D. You can see here, big D and little d came together. Same thing here. So there's 2 heterozygotes. And you can see here, only one of them would be homozygous recessive. So the answer to that question would be 1/4. Like there's a 1 in 4 chance that their child would be deaf, or a 25% chance. Same thing, saying in a different way that their child would be deaf. So those are the kind of questions you're going to get. And again, sometimes I might say, I'll give you the pertinent information. This thing is a recessive disorder. What are the chances of? And I don't have another slide for this. I wish I did to give you some other examples. What are the chances of a carrier mom mating with a deaf dad? Right? You change that to little d. Having a child who is not a carrier and not deaf, right? And then you would do a Punnett square. So again, that's going to be the challenge for this exam. So maybe a few questions, but you need to be able to turn words into this kind of question, right? Or this kind of problem. It's almost like in math when you had word problems, instead of them just giving you the numbers, you read it and turn it into the problem. That's like this too. I'll give you some words and you'll turn it into this. And also really quickly to remind you of the rules of probability we mentioned earlier. So if I said, okay, what are the chances of this person mating with this person having a kid who's homozygous dominant? That's pretty simple. You can see that it's 1 in 4, right? Or the question might say, what are the chances of them having a male that's homozygous dominant? So what are the chances of them having a male? 1 in 2, right? What are the chances of them having a child who's homozygous dominant, as you can see there, it's 1 in 4. So again, to remind you some of this basic math you might have to do on the exam. So what are the chances of them having a male who's homozygous dominant? It's 1 in 8. Nice basic math. So any questions about this? Okay, and again, this is just an example. Point is, on the exam, I will give you the pertinent information. This is a recessive disorder. What are the chances of this mom mating with this dad and this being the offspring? So again, be familiar with Punnett squares. You're going to need them for the exam. And that's another thing I hope to do. Hopefully, oh no, I know I have this. All right, so somewhere in last week's or this week's lab, there's definitely a link to another form where you can do all kinds of practice with Punnett squares, and that you can do that for extra credit. Anyway, that's that. Any questions? All right, one of the examples of recessive disorder, and then this is from the old textbook, so I'm going to include it. I'm not going to ask any questions about it, but it's cystic fibrosis, and it is the most common lethal genetic disease in the U.S., which is probably why the old textbook wrote about it. This is caused by a recessive allele that is carried by about 1 in 31 Americans. So anyway, again, I'm just bringing that up because the old textbook did. I'm not going to ask you any questions about that. It is a good springboard for an extra credit paper, though, if you want to write about it. Because notice I didn't say much about it. So it's the most common disease, lethal genetic disease in the U.S. You see the stats in the U.S. But what is it? For extra credit, you can look that up. Like, what does it do to you? Or if it's the most common lethal genetic disease in the U.S., what about worldwide? What is the most common lethal disease, genetic disease in the world? And what's the stats for that disease? What about the most common lethal genetic disease in Nigeria, wherever you want to choose? You can look any of that stuff up. But anyway, any questions about cystic fibrosis? All right, so that's it for recessive disorders. And remember, disorders might as well be anything. When we talk about recessive phenotypes, a disorder is just a type of phenotype, right? So disorders and phenotypes, same thing, right? To have the disorder or to express recessive phenotype, you need 2 recessive alleles. You need to be homozygous recessive. Now we're going to talk about dominant, right? These are dominant disorders. So again, these are genetic disorders. They're dominant, and they are only caused by 1 allele. But that being said, I'm going to give you an example that's a little bit not normal as far as what I've been teaching you. So this example is achondroplasia. It's a form of dwarfism. Again, for extra credit, if you want to look something up, I said this is a form of dwarfism. What are the other forms of dwarfism? So you can write a little short paper about that. Don't forget to use your sources or provide your sources. Anyway, achondroplasia is interesting because yes, it's a dominant disorder, but what makes it interesting, at least academically, to me this is interesting. If they're homozygous dominant, there are no homozygous dominant people with achondroplasia because it's lethal and they're just never born, right? They're dead before they're born. So there are no homozygous dominant achondroplasia people. The only people who have achondroplasia, in this case then, are obviously heterozygous, which is a unique situation, right? So yes, it's a dominant disorder, and normally for a dominant disorder, you're either homozygous dominant or heterozygous. Either way, you're going to have the disorder. But again, in this case, if you're homozygous dominant, you're just not alive. So everybody who has it is homozygous recessive. Obviously, anybody who is like us, none of us are dwarfs in here, we are homozygous recessive. So no one's carrying this gene, right? You either have that allele and you are a dwarf, or you don't and you're not. Anyway, this is just an example. There'll be no questions on the exam where I ask you about achondroplasia. There might be a question about achondroplasia that I'll give you all the pertinent information. So I'll remind you that it's a dominant disorder, and I'll remind you that homozygous dominant people, don't exist. And then I might ask you, what are the chances of a dwarf mating with another dwarf and their kids being a dwarf, or their kids not being a dwarf, or their kids being heterozygous, right? All these different questions I can ask. So again, nothing to memorize here, but you might have a question about achondroplasia where I remind you that it's lethal, and that homozygous dominant is lethal, and that it's a dominant disorder. Any questions about that example? Again, like I said, you might get a question where I said this person meets with this person mates with this person, what are the chances of their offspring being that? And this is what I mean, right? So I might say, what are the chances of a normal person or, a non-dwarf mating with a dwarf and their kids being a dwarf. And you could look at this, you would do the Punnett square, and like, oh yeah, 50%. Or 2 to 2, right? Or 1 to 2. Basic math, right? 50% chance. And again, it might be something different. What are the chances of a normal person mating with a normal person and having a dwarf? 0% chance, right? What are the chances of a dwarf mating with another dwarf, right? And you can do the Punnett square on that. And I can go ahead and tell you because that would be 2 heterozygotes, 1 to 3 to 1, 1 to 2 to 1 would be the genetic ratio. But anyway, again, these are the kind of questions you're going to get on the exam. I recommend doing some practice. Any questions about that example? Okay, so like I said earlier, dominant lethal disorders are much less common than lethal recessive disorders. I'll underline this word lethal to really emphasize that before I ask you this question. Why is that? Why do you think that recessive disorders are so much more common than dominant disorders? When we're talking about genetics and we're talking about lethal, why do you think that is? Don't overthink it. Look at the big picture here. Also, if it would help, since we just finished talking about achondroplasia, wipe that from your brain for a second, because that was a really unique situation for lethal disorders or dominant lethal disorders. And maybe you can look at this. You know what? No, we'll talk about this, then I'll come back to that question. So let's talk about Huntington's disease very quickly. This is a degeneration of the nervous system that usually doesn't begin until middle age. So very often, someone with Huntington's disease might not know they even have it, right? They're living a normal childhood. They're living a normal early adulthood. They might have some kids. And then it's like, whoa, middle age hits. And my goodness, we got Huntington's disease, and now I'm dead, right? So that's the kind of stuff that happens. Right now this is the case, and you might look this up for extra credit too, because I think things might be changing on this. There might be some groundbreaking research that's been going on. I think it's Huntington's disease where they're coming up with new stuff. But anyway, look it up if you want. Once the deterioration begins, it is irreversible and inevitably fatal. So again, the idea here is that you have a normal early adulthood, an early normal childhood, but then again, it gets bad towards middle age. So all that being said, why do you think dominant lethal disorders are much less common than lethal recessive disorders? So why are these? Actually, now that I think about it, that's kind of a bad example. So Huntington's disease in the context of what I'm asking you here is another bad example, because things don't normally happen like this. So this is kind of an exception to the rule. So maybe that's a good hint. Why do you think dominant lethal disorders are much less common than than recessive? No one wants to guess? Okay. Well, if it's dominant, then all you need is one allele. One allele and you're dead, right? And unlike this example, where they're healthy until middle age, they might be dead early. So obviously, if people are dying early, they're not reproducing, they're not passing along those genes. So that's basically why dominant disorders are so less common, because they're deadly. Like, there's not a lot of people reproducing who have a dominant disorder because it's killing them, right? And the other thing is you only need one allele and you have it, right? So if you have one parent, I don't want to get that deep into it yet, but anyway, one allele and you have it, so that's another reason it's going to be more common. Anyway, any questions about that? I'll put a big old X through here to visually remind you that that's just an example. I'm not going to ask you any questions about Huntington's disease, or I'm not going to ask you to memorize any of this. Again, if I were to give you any questions about Huntington's disease, it'd be this person mated with this person. What are the chances of they're having this offspring? If I gave you that question, I would give you all this pertinent information. I would tell you it's a dominant disorder, all the stuff you need to know. Anyway, any questions? All right, the next word for attendance is King of the Hill. Because Mike Judge, whose birthday it is today, is the creator. One of the creators of King of the Hill. Anyway, if there's no questions about this, I'll move forward. I love the old textbook because every chapter they had something called the process of science, where they looked at a real scientific study, which are actually pretty hard to read, and they made it palatable to 100 level non-biology major students. And it's great because it reminds you of the scientific process and it makes it relevant to this chapter. But I'm not going to take your time reading about it because I'm not going to ask you any questions about it. But if you download the PowerPoint, you can look into it. So we're talking about dog hair. Like I said, look it up or look at the PowerPoint if you want. There'll be no questions, but it's good to get your mind in that scientific thinking. All right, so that's it for recessive disorders and dominant disorders for humans, which leads us to the next logical conversation, which is genetic testing, right? So if we're talking about diseases, genetic diseases for humans, let's talk about how we can test for them. Obviously, there's going to be tests that detect for these disease-causing alleles. Also, this PowerPoint is pretty old and technology is moving pretty rapidly. So some of this may be a little bit out of date and I don't even know it yet. So feel free to look any of this up. I mean, you can say that for anything I teach you. If you had the time, I would recommend looking everything up. Say, hey, I know you said this, but I looked it up and the newest thing is saying this. I would love that. You get extra credit for that. Again, don't forget to use your sources. Anyway, one example, and I'm not going to ask you any questions about this. I'm just giving it to you because this, one day you might have to deal with this in your everyday life. I know I had to, or my family did. Amniocentesis is one type. They use a needle, they pull out some fluid, that fluid that the fetus is in. They, run it through some tests, and that's how they look for these bad disorders. Here's a picture of it happening. You can see it's an ultrasound. You probably can't see this; it's hard to see, but that person's, he's got a needle. He's got the ultrasound, so you can see the baby. Obviously, you want to avoid poking the baby, and that's what's going on there. Here's a drawing of what happens. Same thing, except now it's a drawing, right? You can see the ultrasound, so you don't poke the baby. Stick the needle in right there, pull out the fluid, do the test. There you go. Just an example. Another example, and this is a lot less intrusive, is something called CVS. This is where they use a narrow, flexible tube inserted into the uterus, removing actual placental tissue. But anyway, again, I'm not going to ask any questions about this. Another example is taking blood samples. I think this is very common. You can take blood samples from a pregnant woman and get some of the blood, get some of that stuff, some of it from the fetus, and you can do some DNA tests. Again, do some genetic testing. These are just examples. It was included in the old textbook, so I'm moving into. Any questions? All right, same thing here, right? You get the cells, you test the cells, you give the parents the results, and then that's obviously a very useful thing because then the parents can plan ahead, right? What do I need to do? What disease does my child have? Therefore, how do I need to prepare for it? Or, I don't know, do you guys know what IVF is? It's basically artificial insemination. So generally what happens there is you take, some sperm and you get a lot of eggs. You try to implant a bunch of them, not implant yet. You try to fertilize a bunch of them. And then generally what happens, and you get the choice, and they'll have this conversation with you and say, all right, do you want to keep them all? Some people consider that murder, right? If you have 5 of them or 4 of them that were fertilized, they'll ask you, do you want to keep all 4? Or do you want to keep 3 or 2 or just 1 and get rid of the rest? So anyway, that might help that decision, right? If you don't consider that murder, then you might want to know, all right, well, let's test these individual embryos to see if we want to keep them. Anyway, those are just examples. Again, I'm not going to ask questions about it. Any questions about that? All right, here's the fun part. Everything I just taught you for this whole chapter, mostly not true. I mean, it's true. Everything I taught you is true. But everything I've said is very rare. All these things are not normal. They have freckles, where they're one gene and 2 alleles that cause it. Right? All this stuff is easy to study because there's one gene that's affecting one character, and there's only 2 different versions of that gene. Right? There's only 2 alleles. It's either dominant or recessive. The dominant always over-dominates the recessive. Now I'm telling you that's not normally the case. And now we're going to learn variations on Mendel's law. So, let me tell you this too. A bunch of questions you're going to get on the exam is all this stuff I'm about to teach you. So I'm going to say something like, this thing mated with this thing, and this was the result, right? These were the offsprings. Then I'll ask you, was that an example of complete dominance, and that's a new word, I just told you for the first time, but everything I've taught you so far is actually called complete dominance. So I'll ask you, was that an example of complete dominance, or incomplete dominance, or co-dominance, which is what, these things you're about to learn, or pleiotropy, or polygenetic inheritance, or epigenetics? So there will be test questions where I'm going to say this thing mated with this thing, these were the results. Is this an example of incomplete dominance, co-dominance, pleiotropy, or polygenic inheritance? So keep that in mind as I'm teaching you these things, because that's the kind of questions you're going to get. One of the kinds. So again, sometimes I'll give you the outcome and ask you what kind of dominance it is, and then in other cases I won't do that. I'll say this thing mates with this thing. What are the chances of their offspring being this or that or the other thing? That being said, let's jump into it. Mendel's laws explain inheritance in terms of genes passed from generation to generation according to the rules of probability. This is all still true. Everything I'm teaching you is all still true. It's just now it's going to get a little bit hazier. It's not going to be so black and white. This is still valid for all sexually reproducing organisms, but these rules do not explain some other patterns of inheritance. So basically everything I was saying earlier. So all these little simple examples I've been giving you, they are real examples, most of them. Remember, eye color is not as simple as I made it out to be. But again, most of the stuff, when we talk about genetics, is not that simple. So this is what you're about to learn about. And the first one you're going to learn about is incomplete dominance. In my opinion, this is very simple. And before I teach you, I'll remind you, I'll give you that example that I first gave you. We had homozygous dominant purple flower, homozygous recessive white flower. They mated, and 100% of their offspring were purple, right? Because that is what we call complete dominance. Now we're going to talk about incomplete dominance. Keep that in mind, right? This is what you've learned so far. Now let's look at this new situation. Incomplete dominance is when the F1 phenotype is between those of the two parents. You need to know that. Not that definition, but you need to understand what that means. Because again, for the exam, I'm not going to say, what is incomplete dominance? I'm going to say homozygous dominant red flower mated with a homozygous dominant white flower. And 100% of their offspring were pink. What kind of dominance is that? So you're going to know it's not complete dominance, because if it was complete dominance and I said a homozygous red flower mated with a homozygous white flower and 100% of the offspring were red, you would say, oh yeah, red completely dominated over white. So that's complete dominance. But if I say something where it's in between the two, that is incomplete dominance, right? Because red did not completely dominate white in this case. It's a mix of the two. And most likely, I'm going to make up some stuff. I might say something like this alien or this new species mated with this new species, and just completely make something up. And I might say something like this blue thing, homozygous blue, mated with a homozygous yellow, and 100% of the offspring were green, right? So I guess you're going to need to know a little bit of art for the exam, right? So you need to know like yellow and blue make green, and red and blue make purple, things like that. But just the basics. Matter of fact, I'll probably give it to you in the exam. So if I do give you a question like that, I will remind you, hey, red and blue make purple. But anyway, this is a great example of incomplete dominance. Now, this is just the F1 generation. Just like when we were talking about the complete dominance, we also then cross the F1 generation, right? So we cross these heterozygotes together. The genotype ratio is always still going to be the same, 1 to 2 to 1. 1 homozygous dominant, 2 heterozygotes, and 1 homozygous recessive. That's still the same, but now we have a different phenotype ratio. Because again, remember, when we were talking about complete dominance, if this was an example of complete dominance and red was completely dominant over white, obviously that would be a red flower. It already is. These two would also be red flowers because it would have that one dominant allele. As long as you have the dominant allele when you're talking about complete dominance, then you would have that dominant phenotype. But in this case, it's incomplete dominance. So now the heterozygotes are their own phenotype. And of course, the homozygous recessive are still the recessive phenotype. So that's another way to look at it, looking at the big picture. When we're comparing complete dominance with incomplete dominance, with complete dominance, you only have 2 phenotypes, right? The dominant or the recessive phenotypes. With incomplete dominance, we now have 3 phenotypes. We've got the dominant phenotype, recessive phenotype, and that in-between phenotype that is represented by the heterozygotes, right? One of both alleles. Any questions about that? All right. Also, when we talked about complete dominance, and we were talking about that purple flower versus white flower, I gave a basic description of how that works at the molecular level, so I'll do it here too. When we were talking about that purple flower completely dominating over the white flower, what I said was that allele, that dominant allele for the purple flower is a gene, a working gene that says produce the color purple, right? And the white allele was just a broken allele that just didn't say anything, right? So you have purple mixed with nothing, right? That gene just didn't say anything. So obviously everything's going to be purple because that gene, the white allele, was just broken. In this case, it's different. And again, I'm oversimplifying. This isn't always the case, but this is a great way to think of it. In this case, you've got this one allele that says produce the color red. Okay, that's the big R, produce the color red. Then the other allele, in this case, is not just a broken allele. This one isn't just broken. This one says produce the color white, right? So this time, since that other allele actually works and produces the color, now you have red mixed with white, and that makes pink. That make sense? So again, the reason on the other example with the purple flower, the complete dominance, it was completely dominant because the other allele was just a broken allele. It wasn't working, wasn't providing any instructions. In this case, so that's why that one was white. It was white because there was just nothing saying make this color. In this case, it is making a color. It's just how it happens that the color is white. Any questions about that? All right, the next word for attendance, or words, phrase, if you will, Beavis and Butthead. Also created by Mike Judge. All right, here's a more important example, a real life example, something called hypercholesterolemia. Hyper meaning a lot, right? Like hypertonic, you remember that word. Hypertonic means there's, high concentration. Here, hopefully you would be able to guess this, even if I didn't have all this up here. Hypercholesterolemia, hopefully you would figure out, like, oh yeah, it must have something to do with high cholesterol. And it does. This is a great human example. Again, it is just an example, so before I start talking about it, I will put a big old X through here. Reminding you, you don't have to memorize any of this, it's just an example. But it results in, as the name suggests, dangerously high levels of cholesterol. So a heterozygote who has this has like double the cholesterol that they should have, which is bad, right? When you're twice what it should be, that's not good. But it's even worse for the homozygotes. They have 5 times the normal amount of cholesterol. And a lot of times kids will have heart attacks, like at the age of 2, kids are having heart attacks. So the next slide I'm going to show you shows again at the molecular level how this works. And this is interesting, because it's a little bit different than the example I gave you, right? That last example for the flower color was this allele says produce red, this allele says produce white. You mix the two and you get pink, right? In this case, it's not like that. In this case, sort of like the other example I gave you for the flower, the complete dominance with the purple flower. Remember I was saying this allele works, this one doesn't. In this case, that's what's happening here. So here, if your homozygous dominant, you have 2 alleles saying, I need you to produce this thing that takes cholesterol out of your bloodstream, right? So you see these things here. Those are proteins that take cholesterol out of your bloodstream. So obviously if they're proteins, you have genes that say, hey, make these proteins. So if you're homozygous dominant, you've got 2 working alleles, so you're producing a bunch of those proteins as you should, and you're taking the normal amount of normal amount of cholesterol out of your bloodstream. Now, if you're heterozygous, in this case, the recessive allele is a broken allele, sort of like the purple flower example I was giving you. So in this case, again, the recessive allele in this case is just a broken allele. It's a gene that doesn't work. It's instructions for nothing. So if you're heterozygous, you have one allele that says, hey, make these proteins so you can take the cholesterol out of the bloodstream. The other one is just broken. So because of that, these people are producing half the amount of proteins that they should. Therefore, they're taking half the amount of cholesterol out of their bloodstream that they should. Therefore, they have twice the amount of cholesterol that they should. But anyway, obviously then if you're homozygous recessive, that means you have no working alleles, so you're not making any of those proteins. So for the most part, you're not taking any of that bad cholesterol out of your bloodstream. So if that makes sense? Okay. Again, this is just an example. I'm not gonna give you any questions about hypercholesteremia. And again, I just want to point out that with the purple flower or the pink flower example I gave you, that was a case of this allele working and this allele working, and the results of those two alleles mixing together. This is the case of this allele not working and this allele working, and then the results are, that's the results. Anyway, any questions about incomplete dominance? All right, the next one we're talking about is, it's not showing up there, but it's codominance. And the example we give is blood groups. But blood groups are a little bit more complicated, and you'll see why here in a second. It's probably the last thing we talk about this week. So I'm sure you guys have heard of blood groups, right? Like, are you O positive, B negative, A positive, whatever it may be? You're about to learn what these are. And what makes this a little bit more complicated is so far, everything I've taught you has been two alleles, right? You either have a purple allele or a white allele, a red allele or a white allele, a freckle allele or a non-freckle allele, a cleft chin allele or a non-cleft chin allele. Here, it gets a little bit more complicated because there's a third allele. So again, remember, alleles are different versions of genes, and this kind of makes sense, right? Why are most things limited to just two alleles? They're not. And this is a great example. For here, that we have three alleles, three different versions of the same gene, right? And the various combinations of these three genes leads to these different blood groups. You're either A, you're B, you're AB, or you're O. And again, we're not even talking about plus or minus, right? Like I'm O positive, for example. We're not going to get into the positive. We're just going to talk about the letters A, B, AB, or O. And this is going to make a lot more sense on the next slide. But these letters actually refer to carbohydrates. These carbohydrates are on the surface of your cell. I'll just show you. And this is how, I mean, there's a lot of ways your body does this, but this is just one of the many ways that your body makes sure that things are there that should be, right? They attack things that shouldn't be in there. And this is one of the ways they do it. So for example, if you have an A blood group, that's really hard to read, but that means you have at least one of these dominant A alleles, meaning it's that gene's going to produce this A carbohydrate. And that's going to be what's on the outside of your cells, your blood cells. And because of that, your body is going to attack anything that is not A, right? You're against anything, any carbohydrates that are not A. In other words, you are anti-B, right? So you can take O blood, because O doesn't have any carbohydrates, so it can sneak right through your defenses. Obviously, A blood is good because you've got you are A. B blood is very bad, right? You're anti-B. Your body recognizes those B carbohydrates and says, nope, not my body, and then attacks it, so it's bad. Even AB blood is bad. So yeah, the A carbohydrates are good, but those B carbohydrates, not so much, right? So it's against the B, so your body will attack it. You know what? When we get back on Monday, then we'll restart this conversation and talk about blood groups. That's it. You guys have a good weekend. Don't forget, today, for the first time ever, if you're here, it's mandatory that you send me an email and say, we'll ask you a question about the material. And if you're online, you still need to send me the words too. All the words, not just the last question. Yeah, of course.
So, like,
What we have you gotta pay attention to the course announcements. Check your emails.
okay.
But I can tell you what it is. We didn't do that. We skipped it.
Okay.
And I forgot that we skipped it. So then I had to post an announcement yesterday. Said, hey, question 23, leave it blank. We didn't do it. Glad you asked. But yeah, make sure you keep an eye on those course announcements and emails. Not just for stuff like that, but there's other good information out there that might help you. But yeah, I was about to say you can leave it blank. I won't say you can, do leave it blank. If you want to, you can even write in there reminders like, we did not do this.
Have a good weekend.
You too.